Good afternoon, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm Josie Madison, editor of New York Archives. This will be a thought-provoking hour with historian, author, and State Archives Hackman resident alum Christopher F. Minty, as he discusses his groundbreaking book, Unfriendly to Liberty, Loyalist Networks and the Coming of the American Revolution in New York City. Minty will explore the roots of loyalism in New York between 1768 and 1776, offering a fresh perspective on the political culture and allegiances that shaped the city in the lead up to the American Revolution. Christopher F. Minty is an editor at the Center for Digital Editing at the University of Virginia. He earned his PhD from the University of Sterling. He is also an esteemed New York State Archives Hackman Research and Resident alum and has received fellowships from the British Library, Harvard University, the Huntington Library, New York Historical, the New York State Library, and the William L. Clements Library at the University of Michigan, among others. He is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society and lives in Williamsburg, Virginia. Tom Ruller retired from his position as New York State Archivist, a role he held beginning in 2015. An active professional for 35 years, he is the author of several peer-reviewed journal articles and reviews on the use of technology in archives and the preservation of records in electronic form. Tom has been a consultant for several state governments and other organizations focusing on electronic records management and preservation. He remains actively engaged as a board member and steward of the Archives Partnership Trust. So welcome to all of you that have joined us today. There will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation, so feel free to submit questions using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will get to as many of those as we can at the end of the presentation. And now I am pleased to introduce Dr. Christopher Minty and Tom Ruller.
Thank you, Josie, and hello, Christopher. Good to see you again. This session, this program today, I think is a really important one, given that we're in the midst of the semi-quincentennial, which really here in the U.S. started this past April. But the lead into the American Revolution, the Revolutionary War, really is decades prior to the actual outbreak of open hostilities. And I think it's important for us to put the Revolutionary War and what happened and its aftermath into some context. And your research really helps tremendously, particularly for New Yorkers, because a lot of people don't necessarily appreciate the complexity of New York's politics, its economy, and the people that lived here. So thank you so much for the book. Thank you for the time that you're going to spend with us today to help us understand a little bit better what our state was like 250 years ago.
Thank you, Tom. And I want to start off by just saying thank you for inviting me to do this. I first visited the New York State Archives in 2012, and I did my graduate studies in Scotland, so I came over from Scotland. I'm not really sure why, but I came over in January, and as someone from Edinburgh who's used to a little bit of snow, coming into Albany with feet of snow was something else. and I used to I walked to the archives from where I was staying every day, so I had my snow boots on and my big jacket on. I looked like the Michelin man, sort of making my way down. But I came back in January for a couple of years, and I've done a few other research trips to Albany, and I've always had a fantastic time. The archivists and the librarians there have been so helpful, not only for researching this book and researching my dissertation before that, but various other projects that I've worked on. And without the archivists and librarians at the New York State Archives and in the New York State Library, my book wouldn't have been published. And I can say that with absolute certainty because of the support that I got when I was there, just talking about my research. Like, this is what I'm doing. Help me, please. And then they directed me to lots of microfilms, lots of printed collections that I couldn't get in Scotland. And it was just foundational for my work.
Well, thank you very much for that. Thank you. And I will say one of the great hallmarks and standards that we have at the State Archives and the State Library is the excellence of our staff. They are there to help. And, at the State Archives, we have over 33 miles of records. And it takes staff a a bit of time to understand the scope and the content of that collection. And our job is to help point researchers to things that they may not easily be able to find. And so we're grateful that we were able to help you, and we're very grateful for your praise of my colleagues. So thank you. But, well, now we're starting to talk a little bit about research. And one of the things that I'm curious about is, where did you find the resources to publish, to write this book, to write your dissertation? There's a dearth of documentary material, at least at the state level, largely due to the destruction of the 1911 Capitol fire. But you found a lot of great material. Can you talk a little bit about the sources that you've used?
Yeah, this is a great question. This is like, sources are like my favorite thing to work on. And when I started researching the project, so when I first started this, the project was much larger than what it is. So I was planning to do a comparative study of loyalism across different areas during the Age of Revolutions. And that turned out to be a very, very large project. And of all of the places that I was going to look at, I was going to look at loyalism in the American Revolution in New York and in Virginia. And I wanted to work on New York first. I must say, it was primarily because I wanted to go to New York to do research there first. And when I got there, like, I'll admit, when I started, I hadn't heard of the 1911 Capitol fire. But as soon as I started doing research on New York, you're confronted with that pretty quickly. That it's kind of like a shadow hanging over anyone who works on colonial New York. And the destruction of so many state records means that historians have to like be creative or adjust their approach or their mindset a little bit. So when I started doing this, the first thing I wanted to do was identify as many loyalists in New York as possible. So in a way, I was kind of starting at the end and then working my way backwards. So I started off by going through colonial newspapers that were available online, and I was looking for essentially lists of names, anything where people who went on to become loyalists had signed their name to something. And the first document that I found was a petition that was sent to the New York Assembly from some people in Westchester. It had a list of names, people like Frederick Phillips, Samuel Seabury. These are people who went on to become prominent loyalists, and there were other people in Westchester who signed that too. So that was my first one. It wasn't too many. Then I went to explore some other documents where there were, instead of maybe a few dozen names, there were thousands of names. These were oaths of allegiance administered by the British Army, usually with the royal governor there, and declarations that were left in taverns for a few days at a time in Manhattan for people to come in and sign their names. So over time, the number of loyalists that I had grew from just a few dozen to close to 10,000. And I wanted to identify as much information about these people as possible. And this is where people in the New York State Archives were particularly helpful, especially Jim Foltz, because I was going through their probate records, I was going through some land records, and I started to notice that the same names were popping up together. So people were serving as witnesses or executors on estates in their probate records, and then they were investing in land together or other commercial ventures like buying ships together. And so I started to link these people together. And then to broaden my research out a bit, because I was in the UK, it gave me access to, or easier access to, the National Archives just outside London. And that is a ginormous archive that I don't feel has been fully utilized by historians of the American Revolution, perhaps because it is quite far. A lot of the sources are available online now, but I would go down to Kew, just outside London, and I would go through the correspondence of, usually it was the royal governor or the lieutenant governor, writing back home, writing to London about what was happening in New York. And these gave me a real insight into sort of the week-to-week or month-to-month, sometimes even day-to-day happenings in Manhattan surrounding the Stamp Act, surrounding elections in 1768 and 1769. And then I would read the correspondence going back to New York. Sometimes it was instructions, sometimes it was like, oh, just keep us informed of what's happening. That doesn't sound great. And I would go through that. And if you ever done research at the National Archives in Kew, when I went, they had like an octagonal desk, and you're in your little like space that you have. And my laptop at the time was far too large, so it kind of straddled two seats. So I had to buy an archive laptop, which is one of those teeny tiny ones, so I'd have enough space, because they would give you the volume, and it was these huge, very grand looking volumes with all of the correspondence from, most of the time it was Cadwallader at Colden, who was lieutenant governor and acted a few times as acting governor. There was William Tryon, there was Lord Dunmore briefly, or Henry Moore, and they're sending things back from the news, including enclosures from newspapers, they're including pamphlets, they're including broadsides as well. And these were the sources that kind of gave me a understanding of what political culture was like in Manhattan and how it was evolving. And then there were other sources that I used, published sources of maybe city council records, that were particularly helpful, because I was able to see who served on the city council, who was an alderman, who was voting to increase the number of firemen, for example, things like that. And then 19th century editions by Callahan, they were based on sources in the UK. They were helpful as well. But for the most part, newspapers, other printed materials like broadsides and pamphlets, using voting records, almost, I tried to cast as wide a net as possible and look in places where you might not expect to find anything. So I guess the most unusual place that I did research for the book was the Royal Bank of Scotland archives, just outside of Edinburgh, and well, near the airport in Edinburgh. And I was looking for financial records. And I was interested in if any of the people that I had worked on, and I used to call them my guys, if they appeared, or if they appeared in, like, someone was talking about them. And they did. There was some correspondence talking about Charles McKeevers, who goes on to become a loyalist. Isaac Lowe was mentioned. And then people who, a lot of stuff to do with the quartering of the British Army was mentioned. And so I found a little bit of material there. And I only did 1 day's research there. And I think it only has a couple of citations in the book, but they're there. And so I tried to just be as wide ranging as possible, because you don't know where you're going to find something sometimes. Mm-hmm. You don't know. And they come up in unusual places.
What I especially appreciate about what you just talked about was, number one, the use of records that people don't often look at. Financial records are often very difficult to understand, but 18th century financial records are wonderful because there are a lot of narratives within them. And court records, legal records, which are also a great challenge. Jim Foltz is an expert on it, and he's published a couple of wonderful books on how to access the historical court records in New York. But the using those as a means to get to a different end and exploiting those, that's wonderful to hear you talk about that. I appreciate that a lot.
And a good example of that is at New York Historical. They have the papers of the Rhinelander family, and the Rhinelanders went on to become prominent loyalists, and they stayed in New York after the Revolution and became very prominent New Yorkers. But they had their ledgers, their record books for dealings with Britain, sometimes they wrote letterbook copies of their correspondence in there, and they would write about what was going on and how they disagreed with things that were happening and what they thought they should happen. And that correspondence sometimes tied up with correspondence that I found in London, because they were writing about this, either the exact same thing, or they were writing about what the Rhinelander family thought about something. And that was one of those, like, yes.
Well, the dots
yes moments.
Yes. Yeah. Understood. Let's talk a little bit about Manhattan in 1767, 1768. We know New York today. It's a little bit bigger. There are a few more people in it. Can you tell us a little bit about what was the environment of New York City in the prior to the Revolutionary War?
Yeah. So I think that Manhattan, New York City, is the most important urban center leading up to the American Revolution. Not Philadelphia, not Boston, though they are both important too. I think it's New York City. It's the headquarters of the British Army, the Royal Navy. So there's lots of, after the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War, there had been lots of British troops and sailors there. A lot of them left, but the impact of them being there remained. And on the eve of the revolution, it was kind of like a city in transition. Like by 1775, it had about 25,000 people living in it. It wasn't the largest city in British North America. Philadelphia and Boston probably had more. But it was much more diverse than both of those cities. It was also becoming much more commercially oriented than those two. It was becoming one of the most important cities within the British Empire. And I would say perhaps even the second most important after London. Its population included English people, Scottish people, Irish people, Dutch, German, people from Africa. There were other communities there. And it was, I think, unquestionably the most cosmopolitan city in the colonies. And one of my favorite statistics or stats about that I found during this research is about taverns or pubs. There was one for every 13 white adult men in Manhattan. So you couldn't really walk too far without stumbling across a tavern. And that's partly because the British Army were there and there was still a presence there. But it captures like the density of social life and the importance of taverns. They weren't simply like places where people used to drink. Obviously that happened. But there were places where politics was debated. There was discussed. People used to read newspapers. They were left on the tables. Merchants exchanged views. Information traveled quickly throughout these taverns, and in some ways they kind of functioned as like the city's political bloodstream, in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And it might not have been as large as Philadelphia, or it's seen as radical as Boston. We could talk about that a little bit more because there were riots in New York that resulted in quite a decent amount of destruction. But it was a bustling port town, and like politics, commerce, religion, culture collided in often like unpredictable ways. And the seat of higher education there was King's College, which is now Columbia. And it was a place where when travelers visited the colonies, they often spent a long time in New York because it was a little bit different. And you didn't even have to be from not in the colony. When John Adams visited New York for the first time in 1774 on his way to Philadelphia to go to the Continental Congress, he spent longer in New York than anywhere else, and noticeably longer. And he was kind of paraded around town with his delegates from Massachusetts, including Samuel Adams. And they met all of the most prominent people that were supporting the Continental Congress, people like Alexander McDougall or John Lamb, John Warren Scott. But he was fascinated by what he saw in New York, not just the diversity or the number of taverns or coffee houses, but just by the sense of political feeling there, and just the way that New Yorkers were, because he noticed that they were different. So he quite famously said that they talk loud, they talk fast and all together, and that was the same then as it is now. So that's where it is, like on the eve of revolution. It's still a growing city. It goes up to about where Wall Street is. It's bustling. There's a members library. There's a university. There's lots of taverns. There's coffee houses. There's ships lining usually the East River, but kind of wrapping around Manhattan Island. There's lots of different church steeples, like puncturing the skyline, all different denominations, and it was a melting pot then. like it is now.
I think I'm sure our colleague Russell Shorto would back you up very much. He wrote, he had a very similar perspective on Manhattan 100 years prior to the time period that you're talking about. So thank you very much for that. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the families in New York. And there are a couple that factor very prominently in your book. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about, I guess, not the Hatfields and the McCoys, but the Livingstons and the Delanceys. They were very prominent families in New York. So can you talk a little bit about both the relationship between the two? Maybe focus a little bit on the Delanceys because they factor so much in your book, and they were ardent loyalists. And anyway, I'll stop talking and I'll let you talk a little bit about these two major families, but other families and you've already listed a couple of them.
Yeah. So when I first started doing research on this, I had no idea really what to expect. I started doing, like, when I started researching 18th century New York, you notice all of these manorial estates, all these very large manors going up to over 1 million acres, and you're like, whoa. And then you start looking at what's happening in Manhattan and who's serving in the assembly, sometimes as lieutenant governor or chief justice, and all of these names keep popping up. So you get names like Van Cortlandt, Morris, Phillips, Livingston, Delancey. I was like, who are all these families? And colonial New York was politics in colonial New York was dominated by like a handful of families whose influence reached far beyond Manhattan. And the Delanceys and the Livingstons were two of the most prominent. The Livingstons originally came from Scotland. The Delanceys originally came from France. But their rivalry shaped the colony's political life for almost decades. And William Smith Jr., the historian of New York, in his papers, which have been digitized by the New York Public Library, there's a document in there where he writes about how politics in New York is dominated by the Livingstons and the Delanceys. The Delanceys built sort of their wealth and power on mercantile pursuits. James Delancey Sr. was lieutenant governor and served as chief justice, so they had their sort of judicial strength as well, or imperial patronage maybe, and they enjoyed sort of popular support for a while. Their support was eclipsed by the Livingstons. They were able to gather more support in the sort of decades leading up to the 1760s and up to maybe toward the end of it. They presented themselves as the defenders of colonial rights. Although they were equally elite as the Delanceys, they had a manorial estate up, like Livingston Manor, north of the city. And they also invested deeply in commercial pursuits as well. The Livingston family's power was probably strongest in the Hudson Valley area, but they definitely had a very strong imprint in Manhattan. And their kinship networks gave them enormous reach, because beyond these two families, when you get the Van Cortlandts and the Morrises and the Phillips, a lot of them intermarried. So you'd have people sort of solidifying their sort of status or enhancing their status by marrying into the Livingston family or marrying into the Van Cortlandt family. And when you brought these two families together, it increased their, not only how much they had, whether it was land or money, but it increased their political power as well. It was really interesting to me to research this, to see where the families kind of went during the revolution. That you had people, most of the families were kind of divided along, like there were some who were loyalists and some who became patriots. But the Delanceys, I was interested because they were, and they have been kind of not maybe vilified, it's a strong word, but seen as arch Tories in New York. I'm not sure I found any who became patriots, and they were kind of vilified by historians for hundreds of years afterwards. They were presented as self-interested. They were presented as opportunistic. when they were elected into the assembly in the 1760s, some historians argued that this wasn't because they were interested in helping New Yorkers or advancing their interests. They were only interested in advancing their own. So it was that piqued my interest, because I was like, why did these people become loyalists? Because in the 1760s and through the 1770s, they're saying that they are the Sons of Liberty. They are not people like the Livingston family or any others who became patriots. It's the Delanceys. And I thought, that's interesting. I'm going to explore this a little bit more. And that's what led into the research for the book. And then it was complemented by, the support that I got in Albany by people like Jim Foltz, because the people who I kept seeing who were connected were Delancey supporters. And I was like, this is interesting. So I was able to take the Delanceys as a political group and kind of put the family aside and look at them as a political faction, or political group, and watch how it coalesced throughout the 1760s and into the 1770s. And people coalesced around them in ways that I didn't see with other families. Now, the Livingstons were the most prominent in the book because they were the most prominent during the period in Manhattan. But the Delanceys were, they spent time trying to broaden their support by bringing in these people like the Rhinelander family or the Late family. They sought to bring them into their orbit a little bit, and they supported them, not just at the polls, but in other ways as well.
Well, the role of the Delanceys in pre-revolutionary New York sort of helped create this sort of strong loyalist bent within the populace of the city, within Manhattan. I'm sure they had a tremendous influence on the sort of ambivalence that Manhattanites, I'm going to say Manhattanites rather than New Yorkers, because people confuse the state and the city too much sometimes, but that Manhattanites sort of had an ambivalence about the patriot cause and so on. And the Delanceys, as you say, had an influence there. Were there other factors that influenced this ambivalence, that do you think?
I think the Delanceys had the largest role in that. And I remember going through papers of John Adams for this, because when he visits New York, he maintains like an interest in what's happening politically in the city after he leaves. And he writes to his former law clerk, a guy called William Tudor, and this is in 1775, and he's asking what's happening in New York. Like, what are they doing? They're not doing anything. What's happening? Is there something in the air? He says, is there something in the air? Is there something in the soil? Are they eating something that's putting them off, drinking something, or smelling something that's making them like politically inert? They're not doing anything. They're not mobilizing like they did in the 1760s and 1770s. And I think that when the Delanceys came to power in 1768 in the New York General Assembly elections, a year later, elections were held again, and they solidified their power, and they had every seat for New York City and County. So they had 4 seats. And they had supporters in other parts of the then colony as well. And they were the dominant political group then. And so in 1769, they were the dominant political group in the assembly. And between then and sort of 1774, 1775, it stayed that way. They were the most powerful political group in the assembly. So the legal political representatives were the Delanceys. But during that time, coherent opposition formed, led by a Scotsman called Alexander MacDougall. And then he started to mobilize a lot of broad-based popular support against the Delanceys. And it all originated toward the end of 1769, when the Delanceys reportedly shut people out of the New York General Assembly, where they had previously been allowed to come in and watch their elected representatives do what they said they were going to do. But this time they were locked out when they were talking about quartering British troops. And MacDougall was later imprisoned. and he mobilized a lot of support from his jail cell. And the Livingstons fell into McDougall's orbit and supported him as well. But when you go forward a few years, we have the Tea Act and then the coercive acts, and the Delanceys are saying, we don't support this. We're not in favor of the Tea Act. We don't like the coercive acts. These are, as you say, trampling on our rights. We want them removed. We want them repealed. However, as your legally elected representatives, we will take the lead on it. That this is our action item, is to have these acts repealed. So we're going to take the lead on it. The process of doing that obviously takes a long time because you're having to petition back to Parliament, back and forth. They're writing to their agent in Parliament, who is kind of their representative, and that's Edmund Burke. Things are happening slowly. They're not acting at the pace at which New Yorkers or Manhattanites that they want. People like McDougall are unhappy about this. So, well, we should just take action into our own hands. And the Delancey's like, nope, we've got it. And then that leads to sort of groundswell of opposition, like not necessarily against the Delanceys, because they're saying similar things, but their actions is too slow. It's not happening fast enough. And it's around about 1770. Colden is back in power as acting governor, and he keeps proroguing the assembly. So the assembly is not meeting, so they can't do anything. So that's what things really start to pick up pace with people like McDougall organizing all of these committees that have fantastic names in 1774. So you have it starts off with the Committee of 15, then it grows in size to 50. So it's the Committee of 50. Then the Committee of 51, Committee of 60, Committee of 100, and then it stops. But that is, they're setting up an alternative political assembly then that's taking power away from the official assembly. And the first loyalist document that I mentioned, the one from Westchester, it's to the assembly because they're recognizing that the New York General Assembly is the only legal political body in the colony. It's not all of the committees or anything like that, but it's happening too slowly. And that's when people like McDougall, some Livingstons, and other prominent Manhattanites kind of take it into their own hands. So the Delanceys were relying on the traditional organs of power, and they were just too slow. And things eventually kind of get away from them. So James Delancey Jr., who's he's the leader. He's the figurehead. He's the de facto head of the family and faction. In May of 1775, he travels over to Britain to say their case in person. He's like, I'm going to represent New Yorkers' interests in person to Parliament. I'm going to meet with Edmund Burke because he's my friend, he's my pal. The Marquis of Rockingham, famous friend of America, also James Delancey's friend. He goes. By the time he gets there, things have really taken off back home, and he never returns. He never returns.
It's almost sort of sad. I mean, that's and you're sort of postulating a real change in the perspective on the Delanceys. They weren't. Their vilification may be unwarranted. They're sort of a victim of their own circumstance and a victim of the processes that legal change would and legal representation would require.
Yeah, and the main thing, the main takeaway from the book is that nobody was destined to become a patriot or a loyalist in 1765 or 66, 67. Nobody was the Delanceys weren't destined to become loyalists. And I felt that some historians had kind of projected backward, because they became loyalists, they tried to insert that into their political behavior previously. Where I tried to just look at their actions and compare at the time, and then take them to the revolution rather than go backwards. because they were leaders in the Sons of Liberty. There were other peoples whose surname were not Delancey, who were supporters of the Delanceys and became loyalists, who were also leaders in the Sons of Liberty. And it's people like Joseph Alacoque or Edward Nicol. And then you have people like the Rhinelanders or the Late family, and there are others who they are not in support of the Townsend duties. They don't support the Tea Act or the Coercive Acts. And someone like Frederick Rhinelander, his correspondence that he's writing to his sort of wholesale dealers in Britain, that's what he's talking about. He's like, we are all against this. We do not support this, but we support the assembly.
Yeah,
like doing it the correct way.
Yep, that's one of the things the book is fascinating, and really you do an incredibly great job of this layering of, okay, how did we get to where we are, where we became, and like you say, you don't work backwards, you work forwards, and I think it's a wonderful story.
I tried to just let the sources like really shape my argument, because when I first came to Albany, I had no idea of like where the sources were going to take me, and it was because I was looking at probate records and land records and just noticed that these names kept cropping up. And they like people, and I thought it wasn't like William Smith or John Smith. These were unique names like Evert Banker Jr. I'm like, okay, and Charles Nicol and Joseph Alacoque. I was like, huh, this is interesting. Or the Late family, and then Rhinelander, and then John Jay popped up a few times as well. And I just thought, I'm just going to explore this. And then I would look in newspapers, and there would be they were commemorating or celebrating the repeal of the Stamp Act in 1770. And then they published a list of people who dined together at their favorite tavern, and the same names are appearing. It's like, this is interesting. And then I found at the New York Public Library, there was it's kind of a social club called the Amicable Society. And all of the people not all, but many of the people I was working on were all members. And I was like, that's interesting. And then some of them were members in the Moot Club, which was a law society, but not too many. But some of them were. And then I just tried to I was just placing them together. And then I looked at their voting records, and because the elections in 1768 and 69, the poll lists were published in the either in the early 20th century or in the 19th century. So it shows you all of the names, who could vote in New York and who they voted for. And it was the same people. And I was like, this is interesting. This is interesting. And that's partly why I start in 1768 and not 1765. Because when people talk about the American Revolution, 1765 to 1775 provides you with a nice, neat, 10-year gap where you can just take them from Stamp Act up to Lexington and Concord. And I thought, well, everybody in New York, except for Cadwallader Colden, and maybe people with him, was against the Stamp Act. And I thought, I'm not saying anything new here. Whereas if I start in 1768 with the election and then look back a little bit to 65, then I can really show you how a coherent, organized political group had formed. And it was reinforced in 68, 69. And these people, they came together through their political bonds. And they stayed together. And they started to, they became friends. They started to intermarry, buy things together, go to the pub. They didn't write to each other, obviously, because they were with each other. That's another a challenge of doing urban history, is that when people are together, they don't write to each other. So you have to look at other ways and to show how they were near or with each other. So that's how things like the Amicable Society is helpful, or a dining list is helpful, or probate records are helpful. And that's why I called them my guys, because they came together and they were my guys.
Understood. I want to skip forward a little bit to 1776, which is outside of the scope of your book. But the British occupation of New York City was the longest occupation of a colonial city during the war. New Yorkers celebrated, and still to some extent celebrate Evacuation Day in November of every year, the day the British finally left in 1783. Do you think that the long British occupation, and you mentioned that it was headquarters of the British Army, headquarters of the British Navy, and all that, but that long British occupation had a sort of a collateral impact on the perspective of these loyalists and strengthened their connection to Britain?
Oh yeah, I think that's almost undeniable. And so when the British, I say, take or retake Manhattan and New York, it becomes like it's like a safe haven for loyalists or people who are they might not necessarily be loyalists, but they just don't want to be where they are because the British can provide them with other opportunities, or they might, hedge their bets and say, oh, well, this ragtag army is going up against the British Army and the Royal Navy. It's like, so we're going to go to New York and just live it out here. But for like Manhattan loyalists, who many of them left when the Americans were in control of the city, and many of them went across the Hudson to New Jersey in Bergen County to a place called the English neighborhood. And when the British retook New York, they moved back and they stayed there. And a lot of people didn't. It wasn't the easiest life living in Manhattan during the war because it was under martial law. It was difficult. Provisions were scarce all across basically the eastern seaboard, and they didn't always get what they wanted. But lots of loyalists came to the city. So when I was going through the oath of allegiance for Manhattan, it's this beautiful ornate document that has all of their names and beautiful handwriting. It has their occupation. So I learned that they were chocolate makers who were loyalists. There were people who made wigs. There was a rum taster who was a loyalist. Yeah, a rum taster sounds like a fun job.
Yeah.
But I was researching these people and I'm like, I can't find anything about this person in New York records. And it's like, let me just put the New York connection aside and just try and research this person from scratch. And I was finding people from Virginia who had made their way to Manhattan, people from other areas in the South. And it became, so the longer the British had control of the city, so it has the whole war, the more secure it became as like a loyalist stronghold. So it's because of that, the British Army were based there. The Royal Navy was based there, that people came to the city. And that's why oaths of allegiance were offered not only in Manhattan, but on Staten Island, in Brooklyn, and on Long Island. And the documents are all kind of different, but they generally have the same format where they have people's names and other bits of information vary from document to document. So that the Oath of Allegiance in Brooklyn, which is at the Clements Library at Michigan, a lot of Dutch names, which is interesting, but it was providing like what firearms did they have? Do they have any guns? Do they have any shot, any powder? What's their job? Are they a prominent person in the community? Is there a justice of the peace? So they put that in. And on Long Island, they divided it up into communities, so like Brookhaven, Southampton, and it has their age as well, varying from people who are over 70 years old to people who are in their teens, basically. And when you have the British Army coming, or if you're in Islip on Long Island, and you have the British Army, like they're administering the Oath of Allegiance, what are you going to do? And you come out and you see, it would be quite intimidating. And a lot of people took the Oath of Allegiance because it was as an act of almost self-preservation, or to just we just want to live our lives. So the Oath of Allegiance on Long Island, members of the Call Perspiring took the Oath of Allegiance. Members who signed, people who signed the Continental Association, they also took the Oath of Allegiance. So these documents are useful insights into understanding loyalists and loyalism, but they're also useful insights into just understanding like the day-to-day of everyday life under British occupation. Because if they wanted to, they could make your life quite hard, the British Army. And because they would be looking for supplies from essentially local vendors. And they're like, okay, well, I'm going to try and do it. But oftentimes the British, they didn't pay. They didn't pay these vendors on Long Island or elsewhere. And there's I think it's at the Smithtown Historical Society on Long Island, and like a ledger of one of the people who had dealings with the British Army, and he writes on the front of it that they didn't settle all of their debts. And it's like, well, you chase after the British Army and just see what happens. But yeah, absolutely, I feel that the occupation really reinforced the like that side of the city, and it influenced historiography of New York to this day. And it's given that that's why New York was a loyalist stronghold. I was like, yes, it was a loyalist stronghold, but there's a little bit more nuance there. Like people were coming into the city.
Understood. I want to stretch a little bit and go outside of New York and talk about loyalists elsewhere in New York. I'm a kid from upstate New York, grew up in what was Tryon County, the seat of the Johnson family. And so was there much of a connection between the loyalists? I'll pick on the Delanceys just because that they're the straw person for loyalism in Manhattan, and folks like the Johnsons. Sir William who died just before the war, but was very active in politics up to this period. Was there a connection between him and folks like the Delanceys and the Livingstons?
Beyond like professional connections, like the Delanceys and the Livingstons, and they knew William Johnson, for example, they knew who he was, of course, and they almost certainly interacted in like a professional capacity. They maybe spoke about the imperial patronage and their place within the framework of the British Empire. Personal connections weren't as many as I would perhaps have anticipated, and like Johnson and then like his son John Johnson, they don't get pulled into like Manhattan politics as often as I would have liked, because the papers of Sir William Johnson are fantastic, and I have used them because they offered commentary on people writing to Johnson or Johnson writing about what was happening in the city, but there weren't as many sort of ties as I wanted. I think there are more on the Livingston side of things because they are more prominent north of Manhattan. But in terms of loyalism, like loyalism is not just an urban story in New York. It's stretched into upstate New York, which probably began at like the 42nd Street at the New York Public Library, upstate, and then was through the valleys and the frontier, and it encompassed people and communities with very different stakes in the sort of, I don't want to say imperial order, but the imperial order of things. So the Johnson family are like the Mohawk Valley. They're a really good example because of their ties with indigenous communities there. And that's how their loyalism may have been more anchored around like patronage, imperial patronage. And they thought that their place was better served within the British Empire. Obviously, the Six Nations, some of them thought differently and went in different directions, but there are other families in the Hudson Valley area that indicate this too, like the Phillips family. Like they're in Hudson Valley, and they provide another example of how loyalism was, in a way, like, tied to land and to tenancy. Like their large estates made them one of the largest landholders in the entire colony. They were among the wealthiest families, and to some extent, they relied on imperial authority to guarantee their property. But for their tenants, loyalty often looked a little bit different. So many tenant farmers or smallholders, they saw an opportunity like maybe instead of being a tenant, they can own their land. Whereas some on the other side thought, well, I'm going to side with my landlord here because I think that that's the best thing for me to do. But that sort of divergence, like landlord loyalty versus like tenant patriotism or radicalism, it underscores how class sometimes shaped political choices. But obviously, it wasn't just, and loyalism is not just the exclusive area for elites, that either in Manhattan or north of the city, and the small farmers, artisans. Got my rum taster who was a loyalist. There's probably a patriot rum taster somewhere. But people often leaned on other reasons to decide how they acted during the revolution. It could be kinship, it could be patronage, or the promise of stability. And people may have flip-flopped back inside, and then for free and enslaved Black New Yorkers, loyalism could carry profound meaning. It could offer freedom or the promise of freedom. And then indigenous nations, they also made strategic choices about like what was going to serve their interests best. And that's something that I really feel that more scholarship would benefit on, is indigenous loyalism and black loyalism. Now, within indigenous nations, their alliances were fraught and costly, but they show how they navigated the revolution with agency and calculation as well. I'm yapping.
Well, so now we know what your next book will be about, and we're looking forward to that. But I want to let everybody know about the book, which is just fantastic. And I don't know, Josie, if you could bring up that PowerPoint slide, Unfriendly to Liberty, and which is a fantastic resource. And especially now as we seek to understand better both the roots of the Revolutionary War, but also the outcomes and the players in the war itself. And I think folks can get there's a discount code if they order it from order it online. And I think Josie's put that out in the chat. So if you want to look at the chat, you can find the discount code so that you can order your own copy of this fantastic resource. So thank you for that. I know there's a couple of questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to ask Josie to sort of bring those up for us.
Yeah, so thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions, and one of them is about one of my favorite types of questions, which is about records in the New York State Archives. Does the New York State Archives itself have any significant record collections created by the occupying British authorities and/or military units documenting their administrative activities in New York City and/or on Long Island during the war? Or would they all be in Britain or possibly lost or destroyed?
You want to go first? You're the researcher. I have an answer.
I have the most useful collection that I found is technically in the New York State Library, but you look at them on the same floor, is the Andrew Elliot papers. That Elliot was a prominent British figure during the Revolution, and his papers are robust for this period. And I'm pretty sure there's an Oath of Allegiance in there that I've gotten. I think it's from the Staten Island Oath is in there. But that collection has not only correspondence with a variety of British figures, but there's financial records in there as well, and there's legal records in there too. And there's a broad selection of, like, it'll give you a real insight into what life was like in Manhattan during the Revolution under occupation. That is a very good resource.
But I would add to that, though, the primary sort of official records are going to be in Britain, because of course the state, maybe there might be some references in the published George Clinton records, but that's really Clinton's perspective. I think the British administration, those administrative records during the period of occupation, are largely in Britain.
Yeah, and a benefit of the world we live in now is digitization has increased access to many of these resources. So those that are in the National Archives at Kew, a company called Adam Matthew, or AM, has digitized many of the records relating to the sort of 1760s and 1770s in New York, including the ones that I mentioned when I was working at my octagonal table. They're all online now, like CO5/1108 or 07 or 09. I know them quite well. They're all online now, and it's reference quality scans, but they're easily good enough. And many libraries have access to this now, and it just presents a wonderful way to access material without having to go to Kew. Although that is fun too.
I'll add and you use some of these court records, Christopher.
Yeah.
A lot of the court records in early court records right after the war and even during the war they're not official in terms of official correspondence or communications from the British authorities, but they're the court records of individuals bringing suspected loyalists before the courts in New York for basically being an enemy of the state, which again is another insight and another resource. I don't know if you had much opportunity to use those records. We didn't bring them into the state archives until 2017, but there's another.
I remember you bringing them in, and it was very exciting to me to be able to look at these records, and it's something that I've always wanted to explore in much greater depth, is because I'm interested in, like, I've heard you read stories or you find sources that detail when loyalists were imprisoned. There's one loyalist who's sent underground, said he was underground for 6 months. Whether or not he was, I'm not sure. But the Committee for Detecting Conspiracies, that's a wonderful name. That is something that I wanted to explore a little bit further. But that would have taken me well over the word limit of my book, which I already went over by a bit.
So our next question, I think you answered a lot of this question already in your presentation, but I guess so. I'll kind of rephrase it a little bit. Did your definition of what a loyalist was change over the course of your research, or how did that, you know?
What a question. This is something that I feel like anyone who studies loyalists and loyalism, it has to grapple with eventually, because like I started research on this by finding lists of loyalists, and that's where I went off from. And it took, like, I'm still doing research on all of these people, and I'm finding out new information about them all the time. So within the last few years was when I started to really focus on Long Island, because the book focuses on Manhattan. So my Long Island loyalists didn't get full attention until somewhat recently. And then I found people who were members of the Culper Spiring or had signed the Continental Association. And I thought, well, these people aren't loyalists. Why are they signing that? Why are they signing these lists? And it's like, well, it's an act of almost self-preservation, and they want to maintain, like, if you're a Culper Spiring member, maybe you want to maintain your status. But I don't think it was as overt as that, but they wanted to make sure that things were okay. And I think defining like who is a loyalist or what is a loyalist is something that is quite difficult. And if you go by, some historians have gone by, like, they have to do something public. So they have to sign your name to a list. I say, okay, does that mean that these people who signed the Continental Association were loyalists? And by that definition, you'd have to say yes, but it's much more fluid than that. And I think there's a lot of nuance to it, and it's tricky terrain to navigate. And it's something that I'm still working through, because it's not black and white. Like, and that's what I tried to come through in the book, is that like people weren't destined to become loyalists or patriots. And when they eventually they had to draw their line in the sand, sometimes they just wiped the line away and just did whatever they thought was best.
And again, the book is fantastic. Cornell University Press, Unfriendly to Liberty. If you don't know the code, look in the chat. And if you can't get into the chat, send us an email.
Yes, I was going to say that the chat is closed apparently. So, but yes, go to the Cornell University Press website and the code is 09B card, but that will all be sent to you in an email. So thank you so much for this insightful presentation today. And thank you to everyone who joined us. If you're interested in learning more about the records of the state archives, visit archives.nysed.gov. And if you're interested in learning more about what we do at the Trust, our website is nysarchivestrust.org. It's our privilege to make these events available to you and to keep New York State's history alive. If you're interested in the content we create and have ideas for future programming, please send us an email at aptrust@nysed.gov. And as we mentioned, a recording of this session, relevant links, and the registration for our next speaker series will all be included in the thank you email that you'll be receiving sometime this week. And please join us on October 30th at 12:30 p.m. for our next online speaker series, The Journey of the Seneca Chief, Yesterday and Today, with Duncan Hay, Rebecca Hughes, and John Montague. You can find out more and register at nysarchivestrust.org.